The RSPB is calling for a moratorium on the release of game birds this summer to keep avian flu levels down. The charity says it will be catastrophic for tens of millions of game birds such as pheasants and partridges to be released in late June and July for shooting in the summer and autumn, with avian flu still a huge threat to wild birds. Avian flu is a highly contagious disease that can infect and kill domestic and wild birds. It can also pose a risk to human health and animal welfare. There have been 10 outbreaks of avian flu at game bird rearing premises since 2021. The most recent was in April at Bevis Hall Game Farm, a major facility near Newtown in Powys where protection zones are still in place. Game birds are held in captivity in the UK before they are released for the shooting season. The Animal and Plant Health Agency classifies the birds as poultry while in captivity, but once released they are classed as wild birds for avian flu rules, and their breeder or owner is no longer their legal keeper. About 55 million pheasants and red-legged partridges and 2.6 million mallards are reared in captivity each year for release into the countryside to be shot for sport. Bird releases start towards the end of June and continue through July and August, but before then they can be moved from farms to release pens, which are often unroofed. This can lead to interactions with wild birds, putting them at risk, the RSPB says. The Welsh Government's Chief Veterinary Officer, Dr. Richard Irvine, announced the latest protection zone around Bevis Hall Game Farm on April 27. Under the declaration, game birds are not allowed to be released. The chair of the National Farmers Union in Montgomeryshire, Richard Jones, said it must be enforced and that no birds should release from the farm this season. He said releases would put thousands of birds, including poultry, at risk. Jones, whose farm is within the 6-mile, 10-kilometer protection zone around the Bevis Hall, still has to keep his poultry, which is supposed to be free-range, indoors. He is awaiting the arrival of 21,000 new birds at the beginning of June. The RSPB says there should be a ban on bird releases to stop the catastrophic spread of avian flu. The charity said it was not clear how many pheasants and other game birds were tested for diseases before being released for the shooting season. It also said that most of the UK's game birds are bred in France, where the government has imposed controls on the transport of chicks in regions heavily affected by the virus. Jeff Knott, RSPB UK's Director of Policy, said there was an overriding need to take precautionary measures. If the virus caught hold in commercial pheasant shoots and then spread into the wider environment, it would be too late. The reason we are calling for this now is that the effects of doing nothing could be absolutely catastrophic, he said. We know this virus can spread incredibly quickly and easily. It could get really scary. The RSPB also urged the UK government to impose tighter regulations on game bird hunting to protect wild bird populations and habitats. It said that voluntary efforts by the shooting industry had failed to address the environmental impacts of game bird releases, such as predation, habitat degradation, and lead poisoning. The charity said that game bird releases should be subject to licensing and environmental impact assessments, and that non-native species such as red-legged partridges should be phased out. It also called for a ban on lead ammunition, which can poison wildlife and humans who consume game meat. The RSPB said that game bird hunting was not compatible with the UK's commitments to nature recovery and climate action. It said that game bird releases contributed to biodiversity loss, carbon emissions, and water pollution. It also said that game bird hunting was not a significant source of income or employment for rural communities. The charity said that it was not opposed to shooting as a legitimate activity, but that it had to be done sustainably and responsibly. It said that it supported low-intensity shooting of truly wild birds such as woodcock and snipe, which do not require artificial stalking or habitat management. The RSPB said that it hoped its call for a moratorium on game bird releases would spark a constructive dialogue with the shooting industry and the government on how to reform game bird hunting for the benefit of people and nature. One of the major threats to wild birds is avian flu, a highly contagious disease caused by viruses that infect birds and sometimes humans. Avian flu can spread rapidly and cause high mortality rates among birds, especially those that are kept in close contact with each other. This is the case for game birds, such as pheasants, partridges, and mallards, that are reared in captivity for the purpose of shooting. Game bird rearing premises are facilities where game birds are bred and raised before they are released into the wild for hunting. These premises can vary in size and capacity, but they often involve large numbers of birds being confined in cages, pens, or sheds. These conditions can create ideal environments for avian flu viruses to circulate and mutate, posing a risk not only to the game birds themselves, but also to other poultry and wild birds that may come into contact with them. Since 2021, there have been 10 outbreaks of avian flu at game bird rearing premises in the UK, according to the Animal and Plant Health Agency. The most recent outbreak occurred in April 2023 at Bevis Hall Game Farm, a major facility near Newtown in Powys, Wales. The farm was placed under a protection zone, which means that no game birds can be moved or released from the premises until the disease is eradicated. This outbreak has caused concern among local farmers and wildlife conservationists, who fear that the release of infected game birds could spread avian flu to their poultry or wild bird populations. The RSPB, a leading bird charity in the UK, has called for a suspension of game bird releases over avian flu fears. The charity argues that it would be catastrophic for tens of millions of game birds to be released into the countryside this summer, with avian flu still a huge threat to wild birds. The RSPB says that game birds should be tested for diseases before they are released, and that there should be stricter regulations on game bird rearing premises to prevent further outbreaks. Avian flu is a serious issue that affects both wildlife and human health. By understanding the risks and consequences of game bird releases, we can take steps to protect our feathered friends and ourselves from this deadly disease.